Hey guys, tonight we wake not in your cozy air-conditioned bedroom with a weighted blanket and white noise machine, but on a scratchy straw mattress in the corner of a Viking longhouse, pressed between two snoring bodies, under a stiff wool blanket that smells vaguely of goats and old smoke. The air is thick with the mingled scents of roasted meat, wood smoke, damp fur, and the unmistakable tang of unwashed feet. Welcome to love, Viking style. Your head is still spinning from the mead you drank last night, but your ears are wide awake, because gossip never sleeps. A nearby couple whispers in low voices, not about crops, not about trade, but about a marriage proposal that might have been delivered via a stolen bracelet and a glance across the fire. Love here doesn't always arrive wrapped in roses. It arrives with reputation, timing, and sometimes a goat thrown in as part of the bargain. You stir, feeling the stiffness of your limbs from sleeping on uneven wood planks. Someone farts audibly near the fire pit. Welcome to the reality of romance when you share a one-room house with your in-laws, your livestock, and your enemies turned cousins. You probably won't survive this if you're expecting candlelight dinners and bubble baths. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You roll over and spot a young woman staring into the hearth flames. She's barely 16, her hair braided in a tight crown, and you can see the glint of a carved bone comb tucked into her belt. She's not watching the fire. She's thinking, waiting, planning, because in Viking life, love doesn't just happen, it's watched, whispered about, maneuvered. Romance begins long before the wedding. It starts with glances at the marketplace, with elders observing quietly from doorways. There's matchmaking at work, but not the swiping kind. Aunties, shield brothers, and village chieftains all take mental notes. That girl? She churns butter like a queen. That boy? He wrestled an ox last week and didn't cry. In this world, affection blooms sideways. You don't run up and say, I like you. That's how you get mocked. Instead, your feelings might be passed along in whispers. Or better yet, someone brings your name up around a fire. She's smart with herbs. He carved that ship figurehead. Compliments don't go direct. They float around and attach themselves like moss to reputation. Dreams matter too. The Vikings believed dreams could predict future love. You wake with a gasp, remembering a dream of a wolf standing beside you in a snowfield, and three people immediately try to interpret it. Was it about love, war, both? A dream could spark or end a courtship. One saga even records a woman refusing a suitor because of a dream that his breath smelled of death. Harsh, but valid. Mainstream historical sources like the sagas often present love in poetic, elevated terms, but the day-to-day was more grounded. Matchmaking was practical. You needed someone who could work, fight, tend the farm, and survive a harsh winter, not just make your heart flutter. And yet, sometimes the heart did flutter, and then there were omens, love omens. A bird seen flying left, bad match. A thunderclap during a proposal, Odin disapproves. You begin to notice how many of your neighbors seem to time their romantic moves according to the weather or which animals wandered by. One girl in the next village swears she only accepted her husband because she saw a fox cross her path twice in 1 week. Historians still argue whether these were genuine superstitions or clever ways to make choices seem fate driven instead of personal. Even children knew the language of courtship. They'd tease each other in the meadows, chanting mock marriage rhymes, hinting at who liked whom. These jokes were playful, but also serious training. You learned early on how to signal interest without saying too much, how to deflect unwanted advances without causing a feud. As you move through the longhouse, you see signs of love, both tender and tactical. A stitched linen pouch, handmade, clumsy, obviously a gift. A carved spoon with a hidden rune for desire scratched beneath the handle. A lock of hair tied to a belt loop. These are not grand gestures, but they're meaningful in a world where love and survival are intertwined. You pause near the fire again. The same girl is still there, now with her mother beside her. They're quiet. But you know what's happening. There's a young man from the next settlement. He brought honey cakes yesterday. Not for everyone, just for her. Tonight, they'll talk. Or not. Maybe they'll sit side by side and say nothing. Maybe a look will be enough. Maybe not. But whatever happens, the gossip begins before the first kiss. You can already hear it in the rustle of straw and the low hum of voices behind you. And so, as the longhouse slowly comes to life, love simmers below the surface. Nothing flashy, nothing perfect, just the quiet, careful beginnings of affection, alliance, and, occasionally, adventure. You shuffle out into the early morning chill, boots damp with dew, the cold biting through your wool tunic. Somewhere beyond the trees, a raven caws, a bad omen, maybe, or just a bird with an attitude. You're not sure, but what you are sure of is this. The young man grinning at you from across the field is trouble. Not the he'll break your heart kind. The he just got back from raiding Lindisfarne and wants to show off kind. Welcome to Viking courtship, where sometimes love is wooed with poetry and sometimes with plunder. You watch as he strides toward the settlement, hair braided, cloak flapping dramatically. He's wearing a silver bracelet heavy enough to bend his wrist. Definitely not local, probably not earned peacefully. And now he's handing it, not to the chief, not to the gods, but to a girl standing near the goat pen, trying hard not to smile. Raiding, oddly enough, was one of the most visible ways Viking men could signal their eligibility. You wanted a wife? Better come back from your voyage with something shiny, not just for status, but because it showed you could fight, survive, and maybe even provide if you didn't get yourself killed first. And it wasn't just about the loot. Raiding showed bravery, cunning, leadership. Coming home alive was its own resume. The sagas are full of warriors who fell in love mid-raid, either with a captured bride, problematic, or with the idea of impressing someone back home, romantic, in a very aggressive, axe-wielding sort of way. You see it now, over and over. A man hands over a comb made of walrus ivory. Another brags about how he acquired an Arab coin. He claims it fell from the sky, but the bloody smear on his tunic says otherwise. A third pulls out a delicate blue bead, possibly from Kiev, possibly from a looted grave. Historians still argue whether these gifts were true symbols of affection or just transactional tokens in a very dangerous dating market. And what about the girls? Some are impressed, some are annoyed, some have already been promised to other men, and now the arrival of a new suitor with better bling has made everything awkward. Viking romance often sat right on the edge between love story and social chess match. You walk past a house where an older woman is scrubbing clothes. Her daughter sits beside her, staring dreamily at a pile of stolen silk. The mother gives her a look. You know that look. It says, "He might be handsome, but will he help repair the roof this winter?" It's a fair question, because underneath the shiny gifts and daring tales lies a very practical truth. Viking marriage wasn't just about love. It was about survival, alliances, honor, inheritance. The silk is nice, the beads sparkle, but when winter comes and the goats get sick and someone needs to mend the fishing nets, it's not silver that keeps you warm. It's someone who doesn't run away when the snow starts falling. Still, the showmanship of raiding remains one of the most flamboyant flirtation tools in Viking culture. You find yourself half impressed, half appalled by how much peacocking goes on. A man actually tries to juggle 3 swords while telling a story about fighting 2 berserkers at once. He drops all 3. No one claps. Later, around the fire pit, someone starts boasting about a conquest, not a romantic one, but a monastery. He claims he saw a bishop cry. You can't tell if he's proud or joking, but the girl he's trying to impress doesn't blink. She picks up her mead horn and walks away. Maybe she prefers poetry to pillaging. Not every woman fell for the raider type. Some preferred craftsmen, farmers, men who could build and sew and endure the hard months. Love here isn't one size fits all. Some like drama. Others prefer consistency. A few like both, but rarely get it. You do notice one thing, though. The ones who bring back the best gifts don't always get the girl. Sometimes it's the guy who stayed behind and helped dig a new well, the one who fixed the sheep pen, the one who's kind to the children and good with his hands. There's a quiet strength in that, and it's noticed. That said, the thrill of the returning warrior is hard to ignore. Imagine it. The whole village turns out, drums beating, torches waving. He steps off the longship, sun behind him, armor gleaming. He survived the North Sea, outwitted Saxon monks, and come back with a jeweled chalice. It's intoxicating, even if, technically, it's also a war crime. There's even a term for this kind of romantic display, drengskaper, a blend of honor, bravery, and masculine charisma. It wasn't just for battle. It was how you carried yourself in courtship, in marriage, in life. Be generous. Be bold. Be memorable. Preferably while shirtless and swinging an axe in slow motion. One fringe detail: some warriors tried to choreograph their return, sending word ahead with a servant or a rune stick to make sure their intended was watching from the hill when they arrived, like a Viking version of texting, "Hey, come outside." Romantic, manipulative, a little of both. Historians still argue whether these prearranged grand entrances were genuine or staged like heroic TikToks for the Iron Age. By the time the stars come out, the village is humming with energy. Mead is flowing. Songs are being sung. The raiders are boasting. The parents are negotiating. And somewhere in the shadows, a girl holds a silver pendant to her lips and wonders whether she's about to marry a legend or just a really loud liar. You're sitting by the hearth when an old woman leans in and presses a bundle of herbs into your hand. She doesn't explain. She just nods and walks away, her crooked back swaying like a willow in the wind. You sniff the bundle. Mint, maybe, and something bitter underneath. This isn't for a cold, it's for love. You've stumbled into the quieter, stranger side of Viking courtship. The spells, the potions, the whispered charms that float through smoky longhouses like incense. Because when brute strength and stolen silver didn't win hearts, a bit of magic just might. Love magic was everywhere. If you knew where to look, that girl plucking flowers near the river, she's not decorating. She's gathering tansy and betony for a charm. That boy poking holes in birch bark, he's carving runes, some of them shaped like longing, others like lust. Vikings didn't just believe in fate, they tried to nudge it. Some of these spells were sweet. A girl might braid a lock of her hair into a ribbon and tuck it under her lover's pillow, whispering his name 3 times before sunrise, or she might serve him a stew stirred only with her left hand, thinking it would soften his heart. Romantic. A little creepy. Very effective. Supposedly. Others were more intense. There are accounts in Norse folklore of women tying knots into strips of cloth, binding them with blood or tears, then burying them under doorways. If you stepped over the hidden charm, you were tied to the one who made it. And if it didn't work, well, then maybe she'd try something darker, because not all love magic stayed on the light side. You overhear a hushed conversation near the woodpile. Someone accuses a girl of practicing satyr, a form of sorcery usually linked with women, and often involving visions, trance states, and the manipulation of emotions. The accusation is serious. Sorcery straddled the line between acceptable and outlawed, especially if it involved altering another person's will. Still, plenty of people took the risk. Love spells promised to make someone fall for you, or at least make them think they had. Whether they actually worked? Historians still argue whether these practices were symbolic, placebo, or something more. You dig a little deeper. A boy tells you about a charm that involves catching the tears of a weeping woman and dropping them into ale. If he drinks it, he whispers, he'll dream of her forever. That's either tragic or brilliant, maybe both. In another house, an elder shows you a wooden spoon. Nothing remarkable, until you notice the tiny carved symbols on the handle. Runes for fire, desire, binding. She winks and tells you the spoon once belonged to a girl who cooked for a man until he married her. You can't tell if she's joking. Either way, it worked. Runes, herbs, incantations. They were the hidden language of love, unlike today's dating apps, which mostly involve filtered selfies and passive-aggressive text replies. Viking romance sometimes came down to the right mixture of sage and spittle. Yes, spittle. There's an Icelandic spell that involves mixing your saliva with ash and smearing it on a rock. You then whisper your target's name into the wind. Weird? Yes. But so is swiping left on someone because their dog looks cuter than they do. Even respectable people dabbled, just quietly. No one wanted to be known as a witch, but everyone wanted their crush to notice them. And if that meant sewing a few secret symbols into your tunic hem, so be it. Fringe accounts even describe animals being used. Nothing harmful, just symbolic. A girl might feed bread to a white goat while chanting a man's name, hoping the creature's pure spirit would carry her wish to the gods. Another might bury an apple under a bed and dig it up once the moon had waned. Whether Freya approved is unclear, but the attempts were heartfelt. And while women were more commonly the spellcasters, men weren't off the hook. Some carried charm stones, smooth, carved pebbles that supposedly enhanced attractiveness or charisma. One saga tells of a man who wore a love ring imbued with favor from the goddess Sif. Did it help? He was stabbed later, but not before getting engaged. So, mixed results. You begin to notice how deeply love magic was woven into the everyday. It wasn't flashy or theatrical. It was quiet, domestic, hidden behind ordinary chores. A carved spoon, a braided belt, a whispered prayer over boiling water. Viking love wasn't just felt, it was crafted. Of course, there was a risk. Being accused of enchantment could ruin reputations, or worse. In some settlements, especially those leaning Christian, spells were seen as dangerous, heretical, worthy of exile. But still, they persisted, passed down from grandmothers to daughters, from friends to confidants, because love is hard, and sometimes herbs succeed where courage fails. As the sun fades over the fjord and smoke curls lazily from rooftops, you realize something in Viking society. Not everyone got a love match. Not everyone got to choose. But those who couldn't lift swords or plunder abbeys still had tools of their own, bundled in linen, hidden in kitchens, murmured into twilight. And you wonder what's in that herb bundle the old woman gave you. You find yourself standing near the village well, pretending to check the water level, but really, you're eavesdropping. A cluster of girls sits nearby on low wooden stools, pretending to weave. Only they're not weaving, they're whispering, giggling, and doing what girls in every century do best, analyzing boys. Sheep boy? One girl snorts. He smells like fermented turnips. But he has his own boat. Another counters. And his beard actually connects now. A third adds, thoughtfully, you realize quickly, Viking girls weren't passive in love. Sure, they didn't always get the final say in marriage, but don't be fooled. Between the gossip, the glances, the herbs, and the hymens, girls in this age were experts at navigating romance, sometimes with more power than the sagas give them credit for. You edge closer, listening as the conversation turns tactical. If I marry Orm, says one girl, I get the cow. If I marry Eric, I get the bees. She pauses. But Eric's mother is awful. This is not so much hearts and flowers as a game of emotional and economic chess, played in homespun dresses with strategically loosened braids. In truth, Viking girls often had surprising autonomy when it came to choosing a husband, at least compared to their medieval European neighbors. Historical evidence suggests that a woman's consent was necessary for a valid marriage. Not always emotionally enthusiastic, mind you, but legally. A girl had to agree out loud. No grunting, no shrugging, actual words. You overhear one of the older girls mention this very thing. My father can suggest, she says, flicking a grain husk from her sleeve, but I still have to say yes, out loud, at the thing. She means the thing, the local assembly where contracts, land disputes, and sometimes even marriages were confirmed. You lean against the well, trying to process this. These girls aren't coy. They're strategic. They weigh options, play for time, use clever delays. Tell him I'm weaving a burial shroud, one jokes, and if he's patient, maybe it won't be his. They howl with laughter. You'd assumed Viking courtship was all about men taking what they wanted, clubs in hand, passion in their veins, but what you're seeing is far more nuanced. Viking girls had agency, and they knew how to use it. Sometimes they used it to escape. There's one tale whispered by the firelight, of a girl who was promised to a trader from the east. She waited until he arrived, then calmly married his younger brother instead, claiming a better temperament as her reason. The family never recovered. The goat wouldn't stop crying for weeks. Other times, girls said no. Flat out. There's a famous case in the sagas of a woman named Un the Deep-Minded who turned down every suitor for years. When she finally married, it was on her terms. She even kept control of her own property. Rare, but not impossible. Historians still argue whether her case was an exception or part of a broader pattern of female influence. And then there's the unspoken code, signals. If a girl served a man a full cup of ale with both hands, it meant respect. If she served it with one hand and a smile, it meant something more. If she served it flat-faced and slightly late, reconsider your options. Sir, even her braids mattered. Loosened hair was a sign of openness or mourning. Freshly plaited locks with ribbon? Probably trying to catch someone's eye. Viking life didn't have emojis, but it had signals, and they were everywhere. You look again at the girl by the spinning wheel. She isn't just making thread. She's watching, listening, measuring which suitor will survive winter, which one laughs too hard, which one might, maybe, make her laugh too. And it wasn't all strategy. There was feeling, too. You hear it in the way the girls pause when a certain name is spoken. You see it in the flushed cheeks, the nervous tugs on apron strings, the way they adjust their cloaks when someone walks by. Underneath the practical concerns, land, livestock, family alliances, there's still the flutter of hope. Even so, pressure loomed. Parents, aunts, uncles, even nosy neighbors all weighed in. She's too picky, one says. She won't get another offer like that. He has a full pig pen, someone insists, as though that were romantic. You begin to realize that love in the Viking Age was communal. Your feelings were never fully your own. And yet, that didn't stop people from trying. You notice one girl glance toward the fjord. A boy is coming ashore, arms full of fishing nets, hair tangled from the wind. He looks over, and she quickly looks away, but not fast enough. The corners of her mouth twitch upward. You just witness something simple, real, unorchestrated. A beginning. Not every marriage was arranged. Not every girl was overruled. In between the pressures and practicalities, Viking girls carved out space, using wit, wisdom, and, occasionally, just stubborn silence. As the sun slips lower, casting the whole village in a soft bronze light, you step back from the well. The girls are still talking, still teasing, still deciding who deserves their yes. Not a grunt, not a shrug, but a clear, strategic, quietly powerful yes. Later that evening, you sit near the edge of the longhouse, watching smoke curl up through the rafters as a tense conversation unfolds across the fire. Two elders lean close, beards practically tangled, voices low but sharp. She chose him, one mutters, shaking his head, no. The other snaps, it was the land. His family owns the good pasture. That's no love match. That's a cow trade. You've stumbled into one of the oldest Viking debates, one that still hasn't settled after centuries. Were Viking marriages arranged or chosen? Were hearts involved or just harvest yields? The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in the stew pot. Marriages in Viking society were contracts, often sealed between families, not individuals. You marry into alliances. You marry into trade routes, fishing rights, better grazing, and sometimes you marry to stop people from stabbing each other over boundary stones. Love, if it bloomed, was a bonus, like finding honey in your ale instead of someone's hair. That said, this wasn't a medieval version of marry whoever your dad says. Viking law required consent, on both sides. A marriage without spoken agreement wasn't just awkward, it could be declared invalid. In fact, Gragos, the Icelandic law code, outlines the process clearly. A woman must give her word in the presence of witnesses. That word mattered. Still, the pressure was real. You feel it as you listen to a father listing his daughter's suitor options like a merchant, reciting goods at the market. Orm has 5 cows, a new plow, and no criminal record. That's rare these days. But his daughter stares into the fire, silent. She's weighing more than cows. And here's where things get thorny. There's a second layer to Viking marriage: motivation. Did you marry because your heart skipped a beat, or because your brother owed a debt? Historians still argue whether feelings genuinely factored into the decision, or if the romance came afterward, shaped by storytelling and survival. You hear stories passed around the longhouse like roasted chestnuts. One girl agreed to a match because her family promised her a cloak with gold embroidery. Another said yes just to avoid being married off to a man who chewed his beard in public. Honestly, fair. And then there are the half-arranged matches, the ones where parents suggested, but the couple had already been sneaking glances, passing rune-inscribed spoons, maybe even locking fingers behind the mead barrels. A union of affection and utility. Some sagas romanticize these arrangements. In the Laxdæla saga, Gudrun marries a man she loves, but later regrets the match, not because he's poor or weak, but because he doesn't see her. It's a reminder, even with choice, love isn't simple, and even without choice, affection sometimes grew. A fringe story you overhear from an old shepherd adds a twist. A couple eloped across the fjord, were captured, and forced to marry anyway, because the families figured, well, we've come this far. Whether they stayed in love or just got used to each other remains a mystery. As you look around the longhouse, you spot 2 newlyweds in the corner. Barely speaking, she stirs a pot. He carves something invisible into the table with a knife. They seem resigned, not unhappy, not joyful, just figuring it out. And a few feet away, another couple laughs quietly as they share a bowl of stew. You notice how they lean toward each other without thinking. That warmth? It probably came later, after the vows, after the harvest, after the shared labor of life. For many Viking couples, affection was a slow fire. There's even a saying in Old Norse, love grows with the doing. Meaning, it's not about grand declarations. It's about chopping wood, raising pigs, surviving storms together. You don't just fall in love, you work at it. Still, you can't ignore the reality. Love was often second place. Land, family alliances, bloodlines, those came first. Even gods were invoked during betrothals. The ceremony included invoking Thor's hammer to bless the union. Romantic? Sort of. Nothing says eternal love like a symbolic weapon crashing down over your joined hands. And don't forget dowries. A girl's family typically offered property, jewelry, livestock, servants, to the groom's family. But unlike some other cultures, that dowry wasn't a one-way trip. If the marriage failed or he mistreated her, She could take it back, along with a few choice curses, if she felt like it. You hear another tale, told, between yawns and sips of ale. A man tried to return his wife to her family after 6 months, claimed she was too opinionated. Her father responded by reclaiming the dowry and giving her a better house. The husband was last seen sulking by the river, muttering about goats. As the fire dies down and embers glow soft and red, the elders across from you fall silent. Their argument isn't settled, it probably never will be, because Viking marriage walked the line between feeling and function, between what you wanted and what your family needed, between love and land deeds, and you. You're just trying to figure out which is more important in the end, the girl or the pasture. The next morning, as dew clings to the grass and your breath puffs white in the crisp air, you hear it, laughter. Not the drunk, boisterous kind from the feast last night, but the high-pitched, wheezy giggle of someone being roasted alive, verbally. You follow the sound and find a young man standing in the village center, cheeks redder than ripe lingonberries, while a group of girls perform a skaldic verse about him. The poem rhymes. It's graphic. And if it's to be believed, he kissed like a dying fish and ran from a goat. Viking flirting, you realize, was not subtle. It was poetry. And it was brutal. You watch as the boy tries to laugh it off, kicking at the dirt. But he's clearly rattled. He makes a weak joke about one of the girl's braids, and she fires back with a verse that ends in cow breath. Everyone howls. His face goes pale. Welcome to the Viking pickup line, performed in front of an audience, often in rhyme, and sometimes legally punishable. Flirting in Viking society came in many forms, but the most dazzling and dangerous was through poetry. Skalds, poets, weren't just entertainers, they were verbal duelists. And love poetry? That was high-stakes warfare in syllables. You hear an older woman mutter, "If a man carves a love verse on a stick and hides it in your thatch roof, marry him. If he performs it in front of the chieftain, bury him." Seems fair. But it wasn't just men slinging metaphors. Women composed verses, too, biting, clever, and occasionally lethal. One saga tells of a woman who composed a love poem so provocative that the man sued her. Historians still argue whether it was for slander or sheer embarrassment. There were rules. Insulting someone's honor in verse, especially regarding their romantic behavior, could lead to a holmgang, a duel, and if you accuse someone of being unmanly or bottoming, so to speak, it was seen as more than rude. It was fighting words, but that didn't stop anyone. The line between flirtation and defamation was razor thin and danced on daily. You pass another pair near the forge, trading jabs so layered in metaphors about swords and fish that you have no idea if they're flirting or negotiating a duel. That's part of the magic. Everything is veiled in cleverness. A kiss becomes the touch of the storm's beginning. A failed courtship is a winter that never ends. Fringe details emerge, too. You learn that certain flowers, woven into wreaths, carried double meanings: heather for flirtation, juniper for leave me alone. But nothing carried more emotional weight than a well-placed poem. Some people even had verses carved into jewelry, a token that said, "I like you," or, in some cases, "I'll haunt you forever." And it wasn't always harmless fun. The sagas are peppered with court cases involving romantic verse. There's even a law in Icelandic tradition known as a mead, referring to insults, especially sexual ones, embedded in poetry. Getting caught spreading this kind of verse could land you in serious trouble, socially and legally. So why risk it? Because for many Vikings, love was performance. To love someone and say nothing, that was cowardice. But to shout your passion into the wind, to carve it into wood, to compose a rhyme that made them blush and made the gods smirk, that was heroic. One poem you hear around the fire that night describes a woman's laugh as the clatter of golden bells dropped into snow. You pretend to roll your eyes, but secretly you write it down in your mind. You never know when you'll need that line. There were subtler ways to flirt, too. Shared bread, quiet walks by the fjord, catching someone's eye across the feasting table and raising your mead horn just so. But the Viking heart leaned toward spectacle. Why whisper when you can rhyme? And in a world where matches were often political, moments of real affection, playful, witty, unsanctioned, became acts of rebellion. A clever poem was both gift and gamble. You think back to that poor boy from the morning. He's still licking his wounds, but now he's sitting beside one of the girls, who seems to be helping him come up with a better comeback verse. Their heads are close together. There's a shared smirk. Sometimes humiliation is just the first act of a very long, awkward love story. As the night deepens, someone stands and recites a verse from Cormac's saga, where the poet falls deeply for a woman named Steingrdr. Their love is doomed. His verses never stop. He fights for her. She marries someone else. He writes anyway. You exhale. It's messy. It's bold. It's heartbreak in the shape of a stanza. And, as you pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders, you wonder, in a world full of axes and honor, maybe the bravest thing a Viking could do was rhyme. The next day, as you trudge through mud thick with goat prints and the remains of yesterday's stew, you hear a sudden crash from inside one of the turf houses, a clatter of pottery, a sharp gasp, followed by a hissed, "She knows." You pause. A woman bursts out the doorway, cheeks flushed, jaw tight, apron streaked with what might be soup or blood. She marches past you without a word, but her look says it all. Someone has betrayed someone, and the fallout is not going to be quiet. You've just wandered into the lesser-known but deeply dramatic world of Viking jealousy, cheating, and accusation. Contrary to the myth of Stoic, honor-bound marriages, Viking relationships were laced with suspicion, envy, and more than a few shattered mead horns. Love might be practical, marriage might be contractual, but that didn't stop hearts from wandering, or spouses from watching. You head toward the longhouse and find the husband slumped on a stool, a welt forming above his left eye. He's muttering something about a cousin and a goat and how it wasn't what it looked like. It's exactly what it looked like. Infidelity, it turns out, was complicated. Technically, Viking law didn't treat men and women equally when it came to cheating. A man sleeping with a slave or concubine wasn't always considered unfaithful, depending on his status, the slave's status, and whether anyone minded. But if a woman stepped outside her marriage, that was different. Very different. Penalties ranged from fines to divorce to, in the worst cases, outlawry, exile from the community. Some laws even allowed a wronged husband or male relative to kill the offending lover. Harsh? Yes. Enforced consistently? Historians still argue whether punishment for cheating was more social than legal, but don't be fooled into thinking Viking women were helpless. Far from it. You hear of a woman, sharp-eyed, wealthy, formidable, who caught her husband lying about his fishing trips. Instead of confronting him outright, she hosted a feast, invited his mistress, and waited until dessert to ask loudly, "How's the cod this season, dear? You've been out every night." He choked on a walnut. They divorced shortly after. Women had tools for retaliation, not just shouting matches or dinner table traps, but formal legal action. A wife could demand a divorce if her husband brought a concubine into her household without consent. She could reclaim her dowry. She could even shame him publicly, which, in Viking culture, was worse than losing silver. You see it again when you pass two women arguing near the loom house. One accuses the other of stealing warmth. It sounds poetic until you realize it's a euphemism for sleeping with her husband. The accused scoffs, then throws back a verse of her own, something about wandering hands and goose feathers. Everyone within earshot winces. Another day. Another lawsuit waiting to happen. And let's not forget Satyr, the infamous magic of manipulation. Some scorned lovers resorted to spells, binding runes, potions, even curses carved into bones. You hear a tale of one woman who buried a fish head under her rival's doorstep, whispering a charm to make her barren and unloved. It probably didn't work, but the psychological damage? Flawless. In some places, you learn, it was common to hang protective charms over beds, bundles of twine, feathers, or bits of antler to ward off wandering hearts. One even had a tiny carved phallus painted red. The message was unsubtle. And then, of course, there was public shame. If cheating was exposed, the whole community got involved. Rumors spread like fire in dry moss. Women were mocked in verse. Men were insulted at the thing, and children picked up nicknames that lasted generations. Goat Brother still haunts a family 3 fjords over. You sit by the fire that night listening to a skald recite a particularly juicy saga. It tells of a love triangle involving a chieftain, his wife, and his sword-bearer. When the affair was discovered, the sword-bearer fled into exile, only to return years later, disguised as a traitor. The wife recognized him by a scar on his chest and helped him escape again. It's romantic, tragic, wildly implausible, probably based on 5 true stories and 10 good lies. But what strikes you most is not the betrayal, it's the reaction. Viking society didn't expect perfection, it expected accountability. Cheating wasn't rare. Getting caught and failing to handle it with honor, that was the true offense. And still, some stayed together. You hear of one couple who weathered an affair by dividing the longhouse down the middle with a row of stones. She lived on one side, he lived on the other. They raised their children, farmed their land, and never spoke again. Petty? Perhaps. Effective? Definitely. Fringe details emerge. In Greenland, a woman once supposedly branded her cheating husband with a heated spoon. Another stitched a curse into his undertunic. Another simply left, with the sheep. It's always the sheep. As you crawl into your bedroll, the smell of wood smoke and resentment thick in the air, you realize Viking love wasn't pure or noble. It was messy, human, real. And while axes may have settled some disputes, the sharpest blades in love were often words, side eyes, and strategic silence. The village is buzzing, not with gossip this time, but with bells. Dozens of them, tiny bronze ones, tied to cloaks, horse bridles, even a goat or two. There's a wedding today, and Vikings don't do weddings halfway. You step outside and are hit with a blast of sound and color, blue dyed wool, embroidered tunics, garlands of fresh birch. Children run underfoot, women carry steaming trays of barley cakes, and the smell of roasting meat is so thick in the air you can practically chew it. The whole scene is somewhere between a sacred ritual and a rowdy festival, which, in Viking culture, was exactly the point. Today you're about to witness one of the most symbol-laden events in the Viking world, a wedding ritual where love gets official, or at least contractual, and everyone pretends to behave for a few hours. You spot the groom first. He's nervous, standing barefoot on a woven mat, holding a sword that looks far too heavy for comfort. The sword isn't for protection, though. It's a stand-in. In Norse tradition, if the bride's father couldn't be present, or if he was dead, disowned, or somewhere in Francia fighting, you handed the sword over instead, a symbolic passing of responsibility with a healthy dose of testosterone. You glance over at the bride. She's being fussed over by 3 women, all arguing about the placement of a brooch. She's wearing a cloak draped over her shoulders, fastened with the family key. Not metaphorical, an actual key. Often to the pantry or chest. Viking women were expected to run the household. Giving her the key was both symbolic and extremely practical. You run the house, you need access to the pickled fish. And then the moment comes. The couple approaches one another, guided by elders. Everyone forms a half circle. The air is silent for the first time all day. Then, the cloaks are exchanged. His draped over her shoulders, hers over his. For a brief moment, they're wrapped in each other's world, literal cloaks of belonging. One older man mutters that the cloak swapping symbolizes shared protection. Another says it's a fertility sign. Yet another shrugs and says it's just tradition. Historians still argue whether the cloak exchange was sacred, symbolic, or just cozy. Next comes the bride price ceremony. Despite what it sounds like, this isn't a purchase. It's more of a public confirmation that the groom can contribute through land, livestock, or a very nice axe. The bride's family responds by offering a dowry. It could be household goods, silver coins, or, in one memorable case, 3 geese and a loom. You overhear someone whisper that in some communities, a goat was presented if the bride was known to be especially stubborn. You're not sure if that's symbolic or just shady. The officiant, usually a respected elder or chieftain, raises a carved staff. There's no priest, no chanting, no, "You may now kiss the bride." Instead, there's silence. Then an oath. Each person recites a short vow, often something like, "I take you as my spouse, and I promise to provide food, shelter, and fairness. Not love, not forever, just mutual obligation. Viking style. Romantic? Efficient? Absolutely." And finally, in one, the sword is passed again, this time from the groom to the bride. In some regions, she was expected to store it until their future son came of age. In others, it symbolized her trust in his protection, or her new rights as keeper of the hearth. The feast begins immediately after, and when Vikings feast, they feast. You're handed a slab of roast meat before you can even find a seat. Mead flows. Someone sings a song about Thor's wedding, where he disguises himself as a woman to retrieve his stolen hammer. The crowd loves it. You notice the bride and groom sitting side by side now. She nudges him when he spills his drink. He tries to wipe his tunic and knocks over the table. Everyone laughs. The tension is gone. The contract is sealed, the cloaks exchanged, and now they begin the real journey. Shared life. One of the more fringe rituals you learn about involves placing symbolic items beneath the wedding bed, onions, fish bones, or iron nails, to either ensure fertility or ward off evil spirits. Some couples were even tested by being locked in a room for a night, and if they emerged smiling, well, the union was considered blessed. If they emerged not speaking, that was fine too. Realistic expectations. You ask an older woman what she thinks of the whole ordeal. She shrugs. Marriage is like the sea, she says. Sometimes calm, sometimes storms, sometimes the boat sinks, but at least there's stew. As night falls, fires are lit, dances begin, and somewhere nearby, a goat gets loose and joins the celebration. You're not sure if it was part of the dowry or just an uninvited guest. Either way, it's dancing better than most of the guests. And as you watch the bride laugh, her hand resting lightly on her new husband's arm, you realize, for all its theatrics and symbolism, the Viking wedding isn't just about contracts or cattle, it's about community, about showing up, swearing oaths, and sharing bread, even if it's a little burnt. And maybe, just maybe, it's about choosing someone to help you haul firewood through the next 12 winters. You wake to the smell of ashes and sour beer. The wedding feast is over, the longhouse is quiet, and someone has definitely been sick near the fire pit. But the newlyweds, they're still here, sitting side by side, sharing a cold piece of oatcake, their knees touching like it's nothing, like they've always done this. You're witnessing the first hours of what Vikings hoped would become a lifetime of cooperation, married life. But here's the twist. It wasn't expected to start with love. Viking marriages were built around function, not fantasy. If love came later, wonderful. If it didn't, well, at least the goats got milked. You watch as the husband helps clean out the hearth, and the wife hands him a new bucket for the well. No sighing glances, no dramatic kisses, just teamwork, practical, mundane, necessary. The Viking version of I love you might as well have been I sharpened your axe. The domestic rhythm of Viking couples revolved around clear roles, but not always unequal ones. Women managed the household, oversaw food storage, textiles, slaves, if the family had them, and sometimes even financial decisions. Men handled external threats, building, farming, and raiding, because of course they did. But the line wasn't rigid. If a husband died or disappeared, his wife often ran the whole farm, and sometimes kept running it even after he returned. There's a saga of a woman named Aud who refused to remarry after her husband died, even though suitors lined up for years. She had land, status, and sons. She wore a ring of keys on her belt like a crown, and the villagers quietly called her the man of the house. Not an insult, a compliment. And you hear another tale, whispered with admiration, of a couple who divided chores based on skill, not gender. She was better at tracking deer. He could cook. Everyone said their meals were incredible, even if their neighbors teased them for reversing the norms. Historians still argue whether such arrangements were rare exceptions or quietly common. You're invited into one house where the wife brews ale and manages a ledger scratched into wood planks, while the husband tends chickens and sings softly to the children. No one mocks them. They're simply efficient. And in Viking life, Efficiency was its own kind of love. Still, affection wasn't absent. It just looked different. Instead of date nights, couples spent hours spinning wool together or chopping wood in comfortable silence. Public displays of affection were rare, but you'd occasionally see a husband brush a hair from his wife's cheek, a wife mend her husband's torn cloak before mending her own, a pause in conversation to squeeze someone's shoulder, small gestures, real ones. You hear about one elderly couple who still slept in the same straw bed after 40 years. "I sleep better with her elbows in my ribs," the man says, not unkindly. She responds. He snores like a dying elk. They both smile, and then there were the jokes. Viking humor inside marriage was dry, cheeky, and surprisingly warm. One story tells of a wife who painted her husband's shield pink after he embarrassed her at a feast. He kept using it, called it the Rose of Death. Another woman carved a poem into her husband's axe handle. "May you hit your enemies harder than you hit the chicken coop." He laughed, repainted the coop. Sex? It was expected, but unlike in many medieval societies, Viking women had a reputation for being, shall we say, direct about their needs. If things weren't working, they said so, loudly. Sagas include women mocking their lover's performance, and not metaphorically. One tale ends with a woman telling her ex, "Even your sword was dull." Yikes. You overhear a midwife tell a younger woman that pleasure isn't a sin, it's a right. That if your husband cares for your fields, but not your fire, you might need to redirect him, possibly with a birch switch, delivered with a wink. Yet for all the cooperation and quiet tenderness, not every Viking marriage was bliss. Sometimes the work stayed, but the warmth vanished. Couples shared a roof, but not a heart. One slept near the fire, the other near the door. Meals eaten together. Words exchanged only when needed. Not hostile, just cold, like two ships docked at the same fjord, waiting out the same storm. Divorce, as you'll learn later, was an option, but not always pursued. Many Viking couples simply endured, because in this world, love wasn't always a spark. Sometimes it was just endurance. Sometimes showing up day after day, milking the cows and patching the sails, was its own version of forever. You lie on your back beside the hearth that night, listening to a husband and wife debate which child broke the spindle. They argue. They laugh. He confesses it was him. She throws a pillow. The youngest child giggles. It's not poetry. It's not passion. But it is love. You're watching a feast in full swing. Again. This time, it's not a wedding. It's a harvest celebration, and the mead is flowing faster than the gossip. The air is thick with roasting pork, apple smoke, and something more complicated, tension. You spot her across the fire, tall, sharp-featured, dressed in a deep red cloak. She's not the man's wife, that much is clear, but she's seated next to him, too close to be casual, too familiar to be discreet. His wife, meanwhile, Lau sits on the far bench, calmly tearing bread in half as if it were his reputation. Welcome to the tangled world of Viking polygamy, concubines, and love politics. It's not all that rare. You learn. While most Viking marriages were monogamous, powerful or wealthy men sometimes took second wives or concubines, not just for love or lust, but to signal status. If you had enough land to support multiple households, you could take multiple women legally, debatable, socially, often tolerated, romantically, a disaster waiting to happen. The wife, you notice, hasn't said a word, but her silence is heavy, and you begin to understand. In Viking society, polygamy wasn't just about who slept where, it was about hierarchy. Only one woman wore the key ring. Only one woman ran the longhouse. The others were guests, permanent guests, often bristling ones. You overhear an older woman whisper, "She came with 10 goats. That's why he married her." Then she adds, "But the first wife has the goat barn." Power, it seems, isn't just about who's loved, it's about who holds the keys. Literally. Concubinage also had layers. It wasn't a romantic fling, necessarily. It was often contractual. A concubine might be a captured woman from a raid, a lower status partner taken in without marriage vows, or a servant granted special favor. And yet, despite the imbalance, some concubines rose in status, bearing sons who later inherited land or titles. Fringe tales describe a concubine who ran an entire estate while the wife remained childless, and the husband, stuck in the middle, eventually asked the women to co-manage the household. Allegedly, they made it work. Historians still argue whether this story was idealized or just well edited for public consumption. Jealousy, of course, ran rampant. You hear a verse recited from memory. "She sleeps in my bed, but he whispers your name like a thief with no lantern." It's heartbreaking and painfully common. Sometimes, second wives were welcomed, strategically. You hear of one woman who encouraged her husband to marry again, so the second wife could manage the weaving hall. "Her hands are better than mine," she said, "and I'd rather nap." An uncommon view, sure, but in Viking society, practicality could sometimes soften rivalry, but not always. You witness a shouting match near the cook fire. A younger woman throws a fish, the older wife ducks. "Your stew is as bland as your stories." The younger one shouts. The crowd erupts with laughter and murmurs. This, apparently, is not their first public argument. Someone takes bets on who'll win the next round. And don't forget the children. In a household with multiple partners, the politics got complicated. Who inherited what? Who got named after which grandmother? You hear of a son who was raised thinking he was the chief's heir, only to be displaced when a later wife had a more legitimate son. The first boy left for Iceland, built a farm, named his pigs after his stepbrothers. As the night goes on, you speak with a man who quietly admits he never wanted a second wife. His father arranged it. It brought land, labor, and extra hands during harvest, but it also brought tension, silence, and one too many goats in the kitchen. He tells you he still sneaks away to sit with his first wife, just the two of them, sharing dried apples and old jokes. "She's my home," he says. The rest is just farming. And then there's the flip side, the rare stories of women taking multiple partners. Technically forbidden, but quietly whispered about. A wealthy widow in the eastern fjords allegedly kept 2 lovers. One hunted, the other tanned leather. She managed both. With fairness? And a whip? If needed? Some sagas hint at polyamory disguised as visiting kin or extended trade missions. Love found a way, even when laws didn't allow it. You hear one such tale told in a song by the fire. A man who loved 2 women equally and gave them matching rings. They refused to fight. Instead, they moved into the same hall, raised children, and outlived him. Their tombstones, placed side by side, still stand in some windswept field, or so the story claims. As you slip away from the fire, the man with two women now sitting apart from each other, you can't help but think, Viking love wasn't always fair, but it was always full of layers of power, pain, quiet partnership, and loud goat-throwing arguments. It's nearly dawn when you spot them, two figures at the edge of the woods, standing far too close for people who are just out collecting kindling. Their heads are tilted toward each other, foreheads nearly touching. You hear a laugh, quick, soft, the kind you don't share unless you feel safe. One of them reaches out and brushes a stray lock of hair back behind the other's ear. It's tender, and it's absolutely forbidden. You've just witnessed a secret Viking romance, and not the kind that ends in a wedding feast. In a world where honor was currency and kinship ruled every decision, love didn't always follow the rules. Sometimes it slipped between the cracks, hidden in glances, midnight meetings, or shared chores that took suspiciously long. These were the forbidden loves, and they could cost everything. The reasons for secrecy varied. Some lovers were from feuding families. Others crossed rigid social lines, like freeborn folk and slaves. And then there were the ones who loved the wrong gender, or too closely within their own bloodline. All of them risked disgrace, banishment, or worse. You hear one whispered tale of a girl who fell for her brother's sworn enemy. They met in the forest, exchanged carved bone tokens, and were discovered only when the girl's hairpin turned up at the site of a burned-out hut. He was exiled. She was married off within a week to a dull man with excellent sheep. Another story floats through the longhouse that night about two boys who carved matching runes into the backs of their belts. They worked the same field, ate at the same fire, and never looked at each other for too long in public. When one died in a river accident, the other carved a verse into the wood of his boat and left the village forever. No one spoke of them again, but someone still tends their burial mounds. Historians still argue whether same-sex relationships in Viking society were truly taboo or simply erased by later Christian influence. The sagas don't speak plainly, but there are enough silences to raise eyebrows, and enough poetry to raise questions. And then there's the thorny issue of slavery. Viking households often included enslaved people, taken during raids or born into servitude. And yes, relationships sometimes formed, but whether they were consensual or coerced is an uncomfortable, essential question. Power dynamics mattered. A freeborn man sleeping with a female slave, legal, expected, even a free woman doing the same with a male slave, scandalous, and potentially punishable. You pass one such enslaved couple who sit close under a thatched lean-to, speaking in whispers and singing songs from a homeland far to the east. Their hands touch for just a second too long. They don't look happy. They look like people clinging to the only comfort they have left. In another house, a young woman tears up a letter carved on birch bark, a love note from a boy her family forbids her to speak to. She burns it, piece by piece, and you can tell she's memorized every line. Sometimes the barriers were cultural. A Viking trader might fall for a woman in the British Isles or the Baltics. Their love would be real, but not recognized back home. Mixed marriages happened, but often faced suspicion or outright rejection. You hear about a Russ merchant who married a Norse woman, only to be treated like a foreigner even after 20 years. They liked his furs, someone says, but not his accent. And yet, love persisted, in secret symbols, in hidden keepsakes, in coded verses spoken at night when only the wind and the sea could overhear. One such verse is shared at the end of the feast. An old woman, drunk, leaning heavily on her cane, recites it from memory. It's short, simple, haunting. If I may not hold your hand in light, then let me walk beside your shadow. No names, no blame, just longing. Fringe stories even mention underground rituals, clandestine unions blessed by wandering skalds or forest seers, witnessed by no gods but the stars. Probably fiction, like, maybe not. Love makes people desperate. And creative. You begin to notice how many couples sleep just far enough apart to look innocent, yet somehow always end up drawing water together. How many sudden errands to distant fields get assigned to the same two people? How many broken engagements happen quietly, without explanation? And how many bruises appear on pride, not skin? The risk of forbidden love wasn't just exile or disgrace. It was losing your place in the web of kinship. In Viking society, your name, your land, your protection, they all came from being part of the right network. Choose wrong, and you didn't just lose a partner, you lost your life as you knew it, but still they chose. Still they met in shadows, or in boats just off the shore, or between stacked bundles of hay where no one looked too hard. Still they risked shame, or pain, or cold silence from their own families, because for all its practicality, all its contracts and cloak-swapping rituals, Viking love had one undeniable truth. Sometimes, the heart refused to follow the law. By late afternoon, the village settles into that familiar lull, where the work is mostly done, the stew is mostly eaten, and the stories come out. You find yourself sitting beside an old man with one eye clouded over, a mead horn balanced on his knee. His voice rasps like dry reeds, but when he speaks, the room stills. "Let me tell you how real love ends," he says, "with betrayal, or a blade, or both." Then he grins, "Or sometimes just a baby." You're about to dive into one of the most enduring sources of Viking romantic drama, the sagas, and the tangled, blood-stained, heart-twisting love stories they contain. The sagas weren't written down until centuries later, but they're filled with tales from the Viking Age, tales passed through fire-lit nights and long winter silences. And while they talk plenty about battle and boats and treasure, they talk even more about people, lovers, rivals, mistakes. Take Gisla Saga Sursenar, for example. Gisli is a man caught between his loyalty to his blood brother and his wife's honor. When the friend makes advances on Gisli's wife, possibly romantic, possibly just weird, Gisli ends up killing him. Not out of rage, out of obligation. Then he goes on the run for the rest of his life. Love, friendship, and duty don't mix well in Viking stories. Or Laxdæla Saga, maybe the most romantic of them all. It tells the tale of Gudrun, the most beautiful woman in Iceland, and her tragic tangle with two foster brothers who both fall in love with her. She marries one, regrets it, possibly poisons him, then marries the other, and it doesn't end well. Gudrun eventually becomes a nun, and her final words are, "To him I was worst, whom I loved the most." Brutal. These aren't fairy tales. Viking love stories are rarely sweet. They're full of longing, loyalty, betrayal, and regrets whispered on deathbeds. And maybe that's why they still feel so real. The sagas also show that love wasn't just private, it was political. A kiss could start a feud. A marriage could unite or divide families. an insult, especially one questioning a man's romantic prowess, could lead to bloodshed. You hear about a woman who rejected a suitor with a mocking verse, and he responded by burning down her family's barn. The cows were not amused. The people in these stories aren't perfect. They're flawed, proud, impulsive, and that's part of the appeal, Moe. You see yourself in their bad choices. You recognize the feeling of loving someone who doesn't quite love you back. Or worse, someone who loves your friend more. One lesser-known saga you overhear tonight features a couple who falls in love during a sea voyage. She's married. He's her cousin's rival. But the storm that nearly kills them seals their bond. They survive. She divorces. He loses everything, including an eye, but says it was worth it. She never remarries. It's quiet, unresolved, and strangely hopeful. The old man next to you smirks. They always leave something unsaid, he says. That's how you know it's true. You ask whether these stories were meant to teach lessons. He shrugs. They teach, sure, but mostly they just remind you that we've always been messy. Messy is right. You flip through a carved stick someone left by the fire. It's etched with a poem, short, rough, likely composed by someone half drunk. She kissed me once, in the smoke of the forge, and ever since, my hammer misses the nail. Even anonymous, you can feel the ache. Not every saga ends in tragedy, though some speak of quiet devotion. A fisherman who walked 3 miles every day to see the girl who embroidered his gloves. A shield maiden who laid down her weapons not for love, but to be near the one who made her laugh. Love didn't always win, but sometimes it endured. Fringe scholars even argue that the sagas served as emotional maps, ways for Viking listeners to navigate their own heartbreak and desires. They couldn't talk openly about feelings, but they could tell a story where someone else did something wild and impulsive and suffered for it. Safe, distant, familiar. You wonder how many real romances are buried under those stories, how many kisses were turned into duels, how many whispers became battles, how many people loved each other silently and lived the rest of their lives pretending otherwise. The fire crackles. Someone hums a soft tune. The old man leans back and mutters, "Nah." Love's not for the weak. Not then. Not now. And you nod. Because Viking love wasn't gentle, but it was unforgettable. You're helping a boy unload firewood when something drops from between the stacked birch logs. At first, it looks like just a scrap of kindling until you see the carved runes, small, careful, and deeply etched into a slender stick of yew. The boy snatches it up. "Contains-a-nang." "It's nothing," he says quickly, but the way he tucks it into his tunic tells you it's absolutely something. Welcome to the intimate, resourceful, and often secretive world of Viking love letters, written not on parchment, but in runes, in a culture without widespread paper, where ink froze in winter and privacy was a luxury. Vikings turned to what they had: wood, bone, leather, and iron. Messages weren't sealed in envelopes, they were scratched into sticks, carved onto combs, even hidden beneath belt buckles. And for the romantically inclined, runes were a lifeline. You handle a piece of driftwood later that day, passed quietly between 2 weavers. It's charred at one end, but the runes are still legible. If you squint, when I see you, the fire comes short, blunt, kind of hot. Actually, the Vikings used the younger Futhark, a simplified alphabet of about 16 characters. Not ideal for detailed sonnets, but perfect for messages that needed to be brief, coded, and deniable, especially when feelings were involved. Historians have uncovered dozens of examples: runes etched into knife handles, spindle whorls, even pieces of bone hidden in wall crevices. Some are cheeky, some are sweet, some are straight up spicy. One from Bergen reads, "Think of me, I think of you, love me, I love you." Another, more poetic, "Kiss me, I am like the sun when you do." And then there are the strange ones. One stick simply reads, "I remember the bench." Cryptic? Yes, but clearly personal, and probably unforgettable to whoever it was meant for. In a world where public declarations could trigger duels or lawsuits, runes became a language of shadows. Lovers carved them into bedposts. Friends passed them between their sleeves. Even children used them to prank one another with fake, secret admirers. The Viking inbox had no spam filter. You watch as a woman kneels by the hearth, quietly tracing her finger over a spoon handle. There, along the curve of the wood, are faint runes. You can't read them all, but one word stands out: longing. She catches you looking and quickly tucks it into her apron. Some couples developed entire systems of private symbols, combining runes with pictograms or rebus-like riddles. A flower next to a fish might mean, "Meet me where the stream bends," or "You smell like trout." Interpretations varied, and because love is rarely neat, these messages didn't always go as planned. You hear of a man who carved a passionate poem onto a bone and gave it to a friend to deliver. The friend, smitten with the same girl, lost it and composed his own note instead. She married him. The original author only found out after the wedding. He composed a bitter rune stick in response. "Two-faced wolf drinks my cup." Ouch. Some love letters weren't even meant to be read by the recipient, just left where they might be found. One saga mentions a girl who buried a carved message under the bed frame of her crush. It simply said, "May your dreams remember me." He did. They married. Or at least, that's how the story goes. And occasionally, rune letters took a darker turn. A rejected lover might send a binding rune, a set of symbols meant to dull someone's charms, or encourage them to fall out of love with someone else. Spite mail, Viking edition. There's a stick unearthed in Denmark that reads, "May your beauty wither like ash." Someone was not taking rejection well, but even amid the curses and misunderstandings, the rune letters show something tender: the desire to be heard, remembered, wanted. In an age of noise, feasts, axes, fire, childbirth, the quiet act of carving your feelings into wood felt almost sacred. The materials mattered too: yew for longing, ash for memory, birch for hope. A carved gift wasn't just a message, it was a promise, a talisman, sometimes a goodbye. You overhear one final story before nightfall. A woman who kept every rune letter her late husband ever gave her, tied with twine, hidden in the roof thatch. When her children rebuilt the house decades later, they found the bundle, still intact. She had never remarried. As you lie down in the longhouse, the boy from earlier still cradling that carved stick in his sleeve, you think about all the things people write when they can't say them aloud. All the scratched messages in the world, lost to rot, or fire, or time. And all the ones that survived, not because they were clever or poetic, but because they mattered to someone. The scream comes before the crash. a long, ragged shout from the next homestead, followed by the unmistakable splintering of wood, and then silence. A very bad silence. You and half the village rush toward the sound, mud squelching under your boots. The door to the longhouse is off its hinges. A man stumbles out, shirt torn, nose bleeding, rage in his eyes. Inside, his wife kneels beside an overturned bench, hands shaking, lips split. No one speaks, but everyone understands. Love just turned violent. You're witnessing one of the harshest truths of Viking life. When love broke down, when honor was bruised, when jealousy and grief boiled over, the result wasn't always poetic. Sometimes it was brutal. Despite the romance in the sagas, real-life Viking relationships weren't immune to domestic conflict. And when emotions ran hot, and they always did in small communities built on pride, reputation, and very sharp weapons, things could spiral quickly. The man is restrained by two neighbors. No formal guards, no constables. Justice here starts with witnesses and ends at the thing, the community's law assembly. If the wife speaks out, there'll be a trial. If she doesn't, the village might still intervene. Either way, this is no longer just a personal matter. It's public. Back at the hearth, someone murmurs about honor, another mutters about shame, and a third, much quieter voice, says what many are thinking. He's lucky she didn't stab him, because in Viking law, women could strike back. The myth of the helpless medieval wife doesn't hold up here. Viking women, especially freeborn ones, had legal rights to property, to divorce, and to retaliate if attacked. And while society still leaned heavily patriarchal, it wasn't entirely one-sided. A wife beaten without cause could divorce her husband, reclaim her dowry, and, if she felt bold, challenge his family in court. You hear one such story from a toothless weaver, who smiles grimly as she recalls the woman downriver who struck her cheating husband with a cooking pot and marched straight to the thing. Said he bruised her pride first, she cackles, and her goat. Still, emotional violence left no bruises. Betrayal, abandonment, public insults. These wounds cut deep and lasted longer. One saga tells of a man who, after his wife left him, burned down her family's longhouse, not for revenge, for grief. He died from the smoke. She never spoke his name again. Then there are the accidents. A well-known saga details how a woman accidentally dropped a grindstone on her rival's foot. Another allegedly served soup seasoned with nightshade. Officially, no foul play. Unofficially, everyone nodded slowly and kept eating. Historians still argue whether these violent episodes were common or sensationalized. But the archaeological record tells part of the story: fractured skulls, broken ribs, arrowheads buried in domestic sites. Love could lead to peace or war. Even children weren't spared from the fallout. In blended households, stepchildren often bore the brunt of bitterness. A boy caught between two mothers, a girl ignored by her father's new wife. One folk rhyme warns, stepmother's bread is baked with frost. You overhear a chieftain recounting a particularly bleak incident. Two wives of the same man brawling in the pasture over who had the better lambs. One woman walked away, the other had to be carried, but not all violence came from within the couple. Sometimes it came from outside, from jilted suitors, rival families, or siblings who disapproved. You remember that young couple from earlier? The secret lovers by the woods? One version of that story ends with her brothers dragging the boy to the river. The girl never spoke again. And then, heartbreak. Because sometimes, violence wasn't physical. It was abandonment. A man disappearing during a raid and never returning. A woman refusing to speak to her husband for months. A child growing up never knowing if the silence in the home was punishment or protection. You see it in the old man, who still wears his late wife's key ring on his belt. She left, he says simply. I deserved it. No anger, just the rusted remains of love, worn down like an old sword, fringe story surface, of women forming quiet support groups, sharing dried herbs for healing, or passing down charms to prevent harm, a knot of red thread, a carved stone, a whispered spell meant to keep a husband faithful, or at least calm. Not magic. Not really. Just the quiet hope that something, anything, could soften the edge of a hard life. And yet, amid the bruises and betrayals, you also find resilience. You meet a woman named Brynhild, who divorced her husband after he struck her. She didn't cry. She built her own house, took her dowry back, and adopted her sister's orphaned children. The village watched and followed suit. A year later, she was elected to speak at the thing. Love fails, she says, but I don't. As the fire burns low that night, someone sings a verse that makes the whole longhouse pause. If the axe falls where love once stood, let me build again, with ash and ember. And you know, deep in your gut, that Viking love wasn't just about connection, it was about survival, about knowing when to fight, when to leave, and when to gather your children, your goats, and your pride, and start again. You're sitting near the Law Rock now, the flat, ancient stone where the community gathers for judgment. It's not just a place of justice, it's a stage, a confessional, a courtroom without doors. And today, it's packed. Everyone's murmuring about the same thing. An affair. The accused, a man with a crooked smile and 2 fancy boots, is standing before the thing, hands folded, eyes darting. The woman at the center of it all is nowhere to be seen. Her husband, however, is, and he looks like he's been chewing pine cones all morning. Welcome to the awkwardly public, often theatrical world of cheating and Viking law. Vikings didn't handle infidelity in the dark. They dragged it into the open, right onto the rocks and into the ears of every farmer, fisher, and goat tender in the district. This wasn't just gossip. This was legal business. According to Norse law, a woman caught in an adulterous affair could be divorced immediately. Her dowry, forfeit. Her honor, shattered. And if the community was feeling particularly judgmental, she might be driven out, whipped, or declared Nightinger, a person of shame. Not always, but often enough to leave a scar. But here's where it gets more complicated. Cheating didn't always mean adultery. It's mean proper closeness. 2, sharing a bedroll on a journey, speaking too intimately at a feast, even passing carved love tokens. Proof was tricky, witnesses were rare, and sometimes accusations were more about power than truth. You hear of one woman who was accused by her husband after she refused to share her inheritance with his brother. He dragged her before the thing, swore she'd been unfaithful with a farmhand, and tried to reclaim her dowry. She calmly produced 2 witnesses who swore she'd been weaving socks that entire week. He lost. She kept the land. The brother moved to Norway. Men weren't immune, either. A husband caught with another woman, especially another man's wife, could face legal penalties, fines, or in extreme cases, a duel, or worse, shame. You overhear a whispered phrase, "He was ridden like a mare." In Viking culture, this wasn't a casual insult. It was the ultimate emasculation. To accuse a man of being the passive party in any illicit encounter could destroy his reputation. Historians still argue whether this reflected genuine sexual conservatism or just deep anxiety about dominance and power. One of the fringe punishments you learn about is carving a nidstang, a pole topped with a carved horse head or skull, planted in the ground facing the accused's house. It was a magical curse and a social threat rolled into one. Sometimes it included rhymed insults about what exactly they'd done, how badly, and with whom. You spot one such pole outside a small farmstead. It's old, weather-worn, but someone keeps re-inking the runes on it, like a petty reminder that forgiveness isn't always on the table. Today's case wraps up with a compromise. The accused man claims the woman misled him. The husband accepts 3 goats, a cart, and public acknowledgement that he's still the man of his household. It's absurd. It's tense. It's very Viking. And then, as people drift away from the law rock, they start telling side stories. A woman whose husband ran off with a thrall, but left behind his shoes. She burned them, publicly. A man whose wife fell for a blacksmith. They ran off together. The man remarried and named his first son after the blacksmith. To remember the lesson, a couple who were both caught cheating on the same night with different people, they divorced, then remarried each other a year later. The village made jokes for decades. Their great-grandchildren still blush about it. What you learn quickly is that Viking cheating wasn't just personal, it was communal. Everyone had opinions, everyone took sides, and everyone remembered. These weren't affairs swept under rugs. They were stitched into songs, burned into memories, and etched into law. But the biggest surprise? Sometimes, people forgave. You meet an old couple at the edge of the pasture. They hold hands. She smiles like a woman who's seen too much. You ask if they've ever had trouble. She snorts. "He wandered once," she says. "Thought he'd found something better. Came back after 2 weeks." She glances at him. "He brought soap." He shrugs. "I scrubbed a long time." They both laugh. Because for all the punishment, the curses, the legal drama, sometimes love survived it. Or at least limped along, wearing new shoes and carrying a few extra scars. And as you walk away from the law rock, the wind tugging at your cloak, you realize, in the Viking world, cheating wasn't just a mistake. It was a reckoning. You didn't just betray your partner. You betrayed your standing, your house, your ancestors. But if you were lucky and very, very clever, you might just survive it. The sun is low, casting long shadows across the field, when a woman steps onto a flat rock near the riverbank and calls out, loud, clear, and angry. Everyone stops, even the chickens. She's holding something in her hands, her husband's belt. Not just any belt, the one he wore to the wedding, with the silver buckle she gave him. She tosses it into the river. The splash echoes. This is not a tantrum. This is a statement. You've just witnessed the Viking version of, "I want a divorce." While the word divorce conjures images of paperwork and courtrooms today, in Viking society it was surprisingly practical, if not exactly painless. Under Norse law, Both men and women could end a marriage. No special permission needed. No reason had to be proven. Just a formal declaration, delivered in front of witnesses, 3 times, at 3 doorways, with a clear statement of intent. You walk past a woman who is doing just that, standing at the front door of her longhouse, then the side, then the cattle gate, calling out, "I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you." Simple, public, binding. You hear the whispers begin, not about whether she can do it. Everyone knows the law. The whispers are about why. Did he cheat? Was he lazy? Did he insult her mother or forget her name during the feast? Turns out, none of the above. He sold her family's heirloom brooch without asking. She told him if he ever touched her dowry again, she'd leave. He did. So she did. That's the thing about Viking wives. Many of them were not passive. They had legal rights, property claims, and social standing. And if they wanted out of a marriage, they could walk. That doesn't mean it was easy. You sit with a widow who tells you how she left her husband after he struck her in front of their children. She took her dowry, her loom, and her goat. Everything else, she said, could rot. The goat was more loyal anyway, she adds with a smile. Dowries mattered. If the woman left without cause, she might have to leave it behind. But if she had a valid reason, abuse, infidelity, betrayal, she could claim it all. And in some regions, she might even get a portion of his property. Depends on the community. Historians still argue whether these rules were widely enforced or just theoretical. Then there's the social fallout. Divorced women were sometimes viewed with suspicion, especially if they remarried quickly. But they were also respected, especially if they managed a household on their own. You meet a farmer named Sigrid, who has a flock of 20 sheep, 3 sons, and 0 regrets. Her ex-husband remarried. She didn't. No time. She shrugs. The sheep listen better anyway. Some stories hint at revenge. You hear about a woman who, after her husband left her for a younger bride, sent him a wedding gift, a woven tapestry of his greatest shame, depicted in glorious embroidery. Allegedly, he hung it in the barn and never spoke of it again. Others went subtler. One woman returned her ex-husband's clothes carefully folded, except for the undergarments, which she used to strain pig's milk. Symbolic? Disgusting? Effective? Yes. Divorce wasn't always loud, though sometimes it happened quietly. 2 people simply stopped sharing a bed. He moved his tools to the barn. She took her meals at her sister's house. A few months later, everyone just understood. The village adjusted. Life moved on. Children added complexity. Custody wasn't a modern concept, but both parents usually retained roles, especially if both remained in the same village. You overhear a boy asking his mother why he still sees his father on Thursdays. Because he's still your father, she says. Even if he can't cook. And love didn't always die with marriage. Some couples stayed friends. Some remarried each other years later. One saga tells of a pair who separated after 10 winters, only to fall in love again as elders. They remarried with no fanfare, just a shared bowl of soup and 2 matching blankets. Fringe tales speak of test divorces, couples who separated for a season to see how it felt. If the goat died and the roof leaked, maybe they got back together. If the house got cleaner and the children behaved. Well, you do the math. As the fire crackles that night, someone sings a quiet tune. If I leave, I do not vanish. If you stay, you are not chained. If we meet again, let it be as two trees, not one cut down for the other. And that's the heart of it. In Viking society, marriage was serious, but not sacred. Love was valued, but so was pride, so was survival. And sometimes the bravest thing wasn't fighting to stay. It was walking away with your head high, your cloak on straight, and your goat in tow. The sun has set behind the hills, and the glow of a burial mound flickers in the distance, torches swaying like spirits. Tonight, someone has died. You join the quiet crowd walking toward the grave, shoes crunching over frost-hardened soil. The air smells like pine resin, smoke, and grief. But as you get closer, you realize something strange. There's laughter, not disrespectful, bittersweet. A woman at the edge of the fire is telling a story about the way he used to sing when chopping wood, about how he always burned the onions, about the time he carved her name, wrong, into a comb and gave it to her anyway. This isn't just mourning, it's remembering love. Viking ideas about love didn't stop at death. They continued into the afterlife, into sagas, into whispered stories passed from hearth to hearth. In some ways, death wasn't an ending. It was an awkward, misty continuation. You look into the burial mound and see it. Two figures placed side by side. A man and a woman, hands folded, rings still on fingers, their cloaks arranged just so, a sword laid beside him, a spindle beside her. Were they truly in love, or simply placed that way for show? Historians still argue whether joint burials signified romance, or just logistics. But the symbolism lingers. In Norse mythology, the afterlife wasn't one size fits all. If you died in battle, you might go to Valhalla, Odin's mead hall. If you died of illness or old age, you might go to hell, a cold, but not necessarily cruel realm. Either way, there was space for emotion, for reunion, for something more. You hear an old woman mutter, "He waits for her in hell, stirring soup." Another adds, "If he remembers to add salt, she might forgive him." Everyone chuckles, and someone throws herbs on the fire. Some graves reflect this longing. Archaeologists have found burial goods that suggest ongoing connection, letters etched on wood, tokens from a lover, even matching jewelry between two graves years apart. In one site, a woman was buried with a lock of hair tied in woolen thread, likely from her husband, who died long before. There's even a tale of a widow who visited her husband's grave every full moon, carving a new verse into the stone each time. After a year, she stopped, not because she was finished mourning, but because she had nothing left unsaid. The sagas don't shy away from this kind of tenderness. In Egil's saga, the warrior poet Egil composes a deeply moving poem after the death of his son. It's not romantic love, but it shows how loss cracked open even the hardest Viking hearts. And yes, sometimes grief turned to rage. You hear a song about a woman who lost her husband to betrayal and spent the rest of her life avenging him. She didn't remarry. She became a Godi, a local lawgiver. Her verdicts were legendary. Her anger never softened, but more often, love after death softened things. You see it in the man who still wears his late wife's ring on a cord around his neck, in the woman who reuses her husband's axe, not to remember his violence, but his craftsmanship. In one house, you meet a girl named Thora. She lights a candle for her mother every Yule, and tells her the year's stories aloud. She knows no one is listening, and she knows someone is. And then their dreams. The Vikings believed that dreams could be messages, not just from gods or omens, but from those long gone. A woman tells you she dreamed of her dead husband sitting on their old bench, fixing her shoes. He didn't speak. He just nodded and handed her the mended pair. Next day, she says, I found the missing boot behind the door. I hadn't seen it in a year. Historians scoff. Others smile. Who's to say? One fringe tradition you learn about involves burying lovers with tokens wrapped in cloth. Tokens meant to carry memories into the next life. Not just objects, but impressions. A scent, a verse, a sigh pressed into linen. Romantic or ritualistic? Maybe both. As the fire near the burial mound dies down, someone hums an old verse. No one knows who wrote it. Bury me not far from your door, so I may hear your weaving, and if the wind is kind, I will answer in the threads. And that's the magic of Viking love. It didn't end with death. It lingered. It shifted. It held space in stories and firelight and dreams. You lie back under the stars, the burial torches flickering behind you, and you think perhaps the Vikings didn't fear death because they never truly believed it could separate the things that mattered, especially love. It's almost midday when you're sent to fetch water from the far stream, one of those quiet errands people assign when they want you out of earshot for a while. The sky is low, the trees whisper, and the path winds past the old slave quarters, and that's where you hear it. A low hum, a half-song, gentle, melancholy, not in Norse, not in any tongue you know. Two figures sit close beneath a slanted roof, a girl of perhaps 16, and a young man with soot-stained hands and no shoes. They're not touching, but they are, together. You've just stumbled across one of the least told, yet most moving stories in Viking life, the hidden love stories of the enslaved. Viking society was built not just on plunder and poetry, but on people, people who were taken in raids, people who were born into servitude, people whose names weren't carved into rune stones or sung in sagas, people who worked the fields, tended the animals, made the beds, and fell in love quietly when no one was looking. The girl looks up, startled. You pretend not to see. She lowers her gaze again, fingers brushing the boy's sleeve. Just once. That's all they dare. In Viking law, thralls, enslaved individuals, had few rights. They couldn't marry freely. They couldn't own property. Their children, unless freed, were born into the same status. And yet, they loved, fiercely, secretly, sometimes even defiantly. You hear whispered tales of thralls who carved runes into the underside of bed frames, or passed love notes etched onto bark behind the fish barrels. One pair is said to have developed a secret whistle that meant, I'm safe, or meet me near the sheepfold. Another story tells of a girl who sang the same lullaby every evening, not for the children she minded, but for the boy working the forge just beyond the window. Historians still debate whether these stories are romanticized or rooted in truth. But the evidence is there. Traces in folk songs, fragments of letters, artifacts buried in unexpected places. You meet an elder who remembers her grandmother's story of a thrall couple who lived side by side for years, pretending to be indifferent in daylight and whispering their dreams to each other at night. When the woman died, the man carved a symbol into the base of the tree they used to sit beneath. It wasn't a rune, just a circle and a line, something only they understood. In some rare cases, love crossed status lines. A freeborn person might fall for a thrall, and that was dangerous, not just socially awkward, but legally complex. A free woman caught consorting with a male thrall risked shame or punishment. A freeman sleeping with a female thrall, tolerated, sometimes even expected. But love, that was another matter. You overhear a skald reciting a tale of a farmer's daughter who tried to buy the freedom of the man she loved. Her father refused. She sold her brooches anyway. The man was freed. They disappeared into the forest together. Their names are forgotten. Their story isn't. Some thralls were manumitted, freed, after years of service. A handful even gained land or became trusted household members. One woman you meet, bent with age but sharp-eyed, tells you she started as a cook's assistant and ended as a midwife to 5 villages. She never married, but she had a partner. Once, a thrall like her. He died young. She still wears a scrap of his tunic under her cloak. There are no love poems carved on stone for these couples. No sagas. Just the soft memory of hands brushing beside the fire. The knowledge that sometimes, despite everything, 2 people found a moment of joy in a world that rarely gave them any, and sometimes that joy was enough. One fringe tale tells of a couple buried side by side in an unmarked grave outside the village lines, she with a single amber bead, he with a rusted knife. No names, just bones curled slightly toward one another. Were they free when they died? No one knows, but they died together. You pass the slave quarters again later that day and notice someone has left a flower, just a tiny one, tucked into the thatch. It won't last long, but it's enough, and it makes you wonder, how many grand love stories never made it into songs because the lovers had no status, no silver, no sagas to carry their names? How many lives began, ended, and burned bright for just a moment under someone else's roof? As you carry the water back toward the village, the wind picks up. You hear the faint hum of that song again, just a few notes, rising like smoke, not a cry for freedom, not a declaration, just love, surviving the only way it could. You're standing at the edge of the harbor now, watching as 2 longships glide silently into port. They're not raiding vessels today, they're trade ships, heavy with goods from the east, the south, and from very far away. One man hops off, olive-skinned and draped in a linen robe, unlike the wool and leather worn by the locals. He laughs as he speaks, his Norse halting, but his smile easy. Beside him, a Norse woman, tall, fair, hair braided like seaweed, grins as she hauls a basket off the ship. Her arm brushes his. Their eyes linger. You're witnessing a story that happened more often than you might think. Cross-cultural Viking romance. For all their bluster and battle sagas, the Vikings were also globalists. They traveled, a lot, from Byzantium to Baghdad, from the British Isles to the rivers of Rus. Norse traders and raiders didn't just plunder. They interacted, negotiated, flirted, married, and sometimes fell in love. You sit later with an old trader who tells you how, in his youth, he met a woman near the Black Sea. She sold spices and wore bracelets up to her elbows. She cursed like a sailor, he says, and sang like a goddess. He stayed 2 summers, learned her language, taught her to row. When he left, she gave him a carved figurine. He still wears it around his neck. She saved my life once, he adds, then nearly drowned me for snoring. These relationships weren't rare. Norsemen often took local wives abroad, sometimes through trade agreements, sometimes by choice, sometimes not so ethically. But love, that bloomed in unpredictable ways. You hear of a Russ merchant who married an Irish monk's daughter, a Jutland farmer who brought home a woman from Hispania, a woman from Hedeby who ran off with a Persian sailor and was later spotted in Constantinople selling honeyed wine. Not everyone approved. You listen as one grandmother whispers disapprovingly about southern manners and strange spices. She clutches her cloak tighter when the olive-skinned man walks by. Her granddaughter, on the other hand, watches him with a look that says she's very interested in strange spices. Historians still argue whether such relationships were common enough to shift culture or simply romantic footnotes in a wider world of violence and trade. But the artifacts suggest something lasting. Arabic coins found in Viking graves, glass beads from the East sewn into Norse tunics, children with mixed ancestry, buried with care. You pass one such child's grave, a small girl, no more than 5, buried with both a Thor's hammer and a cross. 2 cultures, 1 family. Language, of course, was a barrier, but not insurmountable. You meet a couple who communicate mostly in gestures and laughter. He speaks a bit of Greek, she a bit of Norse, and both seem fluent in pointing at things and raising eyebrows. It works. They seem happy. In some places, especially in trading towns like Birka and Dublin, mixed communities flourished. Markets rang with multiple tongues. Children grew up bilingual. Spices mingled with saltfish. And in between the bustle of commerce and construction, people found each other. One fringe story tells of a woman who fell for a Muslim scholar traveling through Russ territory. Their love was forbidden, and when they were discovered, he was sent away. She carved a message into the tree by the riverbank. I watched your boat until the water forgot it. It's still there, they say, though no one agrees on which tree. Not all stories ended in heartbreak. Some cross-cultural marriages were strong, respected, even admired. You hear of a Norse woman who wore silk veils in the Eastern fashion, and hosted feasts with dates and cinnamon, served alongside barley stew. Her neighbors came for the novelty, stayed for the gossip, and eventually asked for her recipes. And yet, not all were equal. A foreign woman married into a Norse family might always be the outsider. A foreign man might have to prove himself through trade, through oaths, through gifts. But love had a way of softening sharp edges. You speak to a young man who says his mother sang lullabies in Old Norse and braided his hair like his Persian grandfather. I belong to both, he says, which means I belong to everywhere. Later that evening, a feast begins on the dock. The foreign trader plays a stringed instrument you've never seen. The Norse woman beside him hums along, off-key but confident. They dance. Others join. No one asks who was born where. As the stars rise, you lie on your back, thinking of all the pairings forged in the in-between places, on boats, in markets, beside foreign fires, of all the loves that crossed borders, defied customs, whispered promises in mismatched accents. In the Viking world, love wasn't always easy, but sometimes it was brave. The longhouse is quieter than usual tonight. No feasting, no shouting, just the crackle of the fire and the gentle snoring of someone who fell asleep on a sheepskin too close to the stew. You're curled near the hearth, watching the flames dance, when someone, an old woman with white braids and a wheeze like a broken bellows, leans in and says, "Do you want to hear the truth?" You nod. Of course. She smiles, toothless and warm. Half of what you've heard is true. The other half? Well, it's stories. But we need those too. Because now, at the end of your long, smoky, wool-scratched journey through Viking love, it's time to ask the final question. What was real, and what was legend? You've heard of fierce warrior brides and jealous co-wives, of rune-strewn love letters and kisses exchanged beside the forge, of loyalty that lasted through war and time, and of betrayal that ended in blood. But were Viking romances really that dramatic, that free, that tragic? Historians still argue whether the sagas were history or glorified gossip, whether joint burials reflected love or convenience, whether poetry was personal or just clever men showing off, whether marriage was about passion or just pasture. And the truth is, probably all of it. Because love in the Viking Age wasn't one thing. It wasn't just arranged or romantic, free or bound, practical or passionate. It was all of that watcher jumbled together like a stew, root vegetables, meat, and the occasional tooth-breaking pebble someone forgot to wash off. You remember the boy with the carved rune stick trembling in the shadows. The couple who divorced with quiet dignity and shared custody of their goats. The slave woman who sang lullabies in a language no one else understood. The girl who whispered to a foreign sailor under the torchlight and didn't care who saw. You remember the cloak exchanges, the jealous outbursts, the verse battles, the stolen kisses, the spoon handles with scratched-in runes. Viking love was messy, not always noble, not always mutual, sometimes cruel, sometimes exquisite, but always human. And that's what survives. Not just in graves or saga pages, but in the way people looked at each other when they thought no one noticed. In the burned bread saved for someone who likes it that way. In the stitches mended in a shirt, too worn to matter. In the silence between two people who no longer need to speak to feel close. The old woman pats your arm. Even the gods got it wrong, she says. Odin wandered. Freya wept. Loki. Well, don't get me started on Loki. Everyone laughs, even the ones half asleep, because even gods, with all their power, couldn't sort out love. And maybe that's comforting, because love, in the end, is not something we conquer. It's something we weather, like wind, like snow, like time. You lie back on your straw mat, watching smoke snake through the rafters. Somewhere, someone hums a verse. It's not about war. It's not about fate. It's about two people who met and laughed and maybe made it work. And as your eyelids grow heavy, you understand the secret. In Viking life, love wasn't always carved into stone. Sometimes it was whispered in wood smoke, carried in a comb, tucked behind a braid, buried in snow, and remembered in spring. The longhouse fades into a hush now, as if even the walls are breathing slower. The embers glow low in the hearth, casting gentle ripples of light across fur and wool and slumbering forms. The goats outside have stopped complaining. Even the wind seems to tread more softly past the door. You shift beneath your rough-spun blanket, warm despite the chill. The air smells faintly of ash and dried lavender. Somewhere, someone stirs and then settles again. You're safe. You're warm. You're full of stories. Let them drift now, one by one, into the quiet spaces behind your eyes. Let the warrior brides and goat-throwing co-wives, the secret kisses and carved runes, melt into the soft folds of your dreams. Let the laughter echo in the distance. Let the pain ease. Let the love, awkward, clumsy, brave, rest for a while. Because no matter the century, no matter the customs or contracts or dowries, some things don't change. We all hope to be seen, to be held, to be chosen, even if it's just for one cold night beside a fire. So close your eyes, if you haven't already. Let the flickering shadows keep you company. Let the soft breathing of sleepers lull you deeper. Let the sagas wait until tomorrow. You've walked far tonight, and love, after all, will still be here when you wake. End of script. Sweet dreams.